Every Catholic has heard the word pilgrimage, but what exactly is a pilgrimage? And what makes a place pilgrimage worthy? Are there holy sites in the United States of America? Join us today as we answer those questions and many more with Dr. Kevin Schmiesing, historian and lecturer at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology. I'm Father Pivonka, and I'm president at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and you're watching Franciscan University Presents. Please stay with us. Welcome to Franciscan University Presents. I'm your host, Father Pivonka, and I'm president at Franciscan University in Steubenville. Today we're going to be discussing the practice of pilgrimage and the historic American Catholic pilgrimage sites. I'm here with our regular panelists, Dr. Regis Martin, professor of systematic theology here at Franciscan, and Dr. Scott Hahn, Father Michael Scanlon, professor of biblical theology and new evangelization here at Franciscan. We're pleased to welcome our guest, Franciscan University alumni, which is your greatest claim to fame, I would say, Dr. Kevin Schmiesing. He's a historian and a lecturer at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology. He is also the author of the book that we'll be discussing today, A Catholic Pilgrimage Through American History. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Father. My pleasure.
So this was a fun book, actually. What kind of spurred you to write it? Where did the idea come from? Seems like it was always a part of your growing up, but maybe share with us how that happened.
Yeah. Well, it was a fun book to write, to be honest with you.
Not all books are.
No, I'm sure that's true. It was kind of a hobby, actually. It's really a compilation of stories that I've been collecting for a long time. So I'm a professional historian by training, and I've written in academic journals, and I've written some other academic books. That had been my history of writing up until the time I took this book on. But a few years before I wrote the book, actually, I started to dabble in more popular history, and I wrote a few articles for websites, and I got on Catholic radio. I do a regular weekly segment for Catholic radio, and so I talked about some of these sites and some of the interesting stories about fascinating Catholic people in the American past, many of whom I had never heard of, in my professional study of history. And yet I kept coming across these people as I kind of in the course of that academic work, but was never able to focus on them or explore them more deeply. And then just my own experiences, my own travel through family vacations or traveling for conferences or that sort of thing. Kept collecting these stories, and so it may sound kind of mundane, but really I'd say the primary inspiration for the book was that I wanted to share interesting stories. I thought I found these fascinating as an American Catholic, as someone who identified strongly as both of those dimensions, both as a Catholic and as an American. There's so much fascinating American Catholic history, specifically fascinating people, important people, and events and places, which is the lens through which I wrote the book, was focusing on this set of 20-some places. And I just wanted to share those stories. So that was the inspiration. There was a lot more to it than that. As I got into it, I discovered, hey, I can say a lot of other important things along the way here, but that's kind of what got me rolling.
I can't resist asking you about John Carrig, because you dedicated the book to him. That was really quite moving to come across that. He must have had a hand in shaping your historical perspective, inspiring you, infusing you.
Storytelling, especially.
Yeah, sure did.
He was a legendary figure.
That's exactly what my answer was going to be. He was the master storyteller.
He really was. So for those who don't, tell who Dr. Carrig was.
Yeah, Dr. Carrig was a longtime professor here, 50-some years, I think. He taught here. I had him, I guess, toward the end of his career, you could say, in the early 90s. He was already a legend on campus, but taught here for a number of years farther. And I can't even tell you how many classes I took with him. I was a history major, and I took a lot of classes with him, I can tell you that. But he was one of these lecturers who wouldn't use notes. He'd just stand at the front of the class.
And sometimes on top of a chair. Or a desk, right?
Yes, he was animated and expressive, and told stories. And just to give one example, I took a class on World War II,
I took
which
that class.
was okay.
One of
So
the best classes.
So by the 1990s, of course, that's in the distant past for someone born in the early 70s. But he was there. he fought in World War II.
Right.
And so he told the history of the war, but also in a very personal way. He knew guys who died in the war.
Yeah.
And that's also, that played into the way I did this book too, because I had my own experiences. I'll tell one just to give an example. When I was in college here at the time in the 90s, and some college buddies and I went to see the movie Gettysburg, which came out in the early 1990s. It's a very faithful telling of the history of the battle.
You mentioned in the book as well.
I mentioned in the book, the film. And then I visited the battlefield at Gettysburg, maybe a couple of years later, and having studied the history of the battle, also took a Civil War course here, by the way. That was with Jack Boyd, not John Carrick, but another legend.
In the middle of
another
class.
legend. So studied the history, watched the movie, which was filmed on location in Gettysburg, and then went to the battlefield. And I had a moving experience. I realized that if I had been born in a different time and place, not even a different place, Ohio, there were lots of Ohioans who fought in the war at a different time, I might have been on this battlefield.
Right.
I might have been buried at this battlefield.
I had a great-grandfather who was a soldier and fought at Gettysburg on the Yankee side, thank God. But he was captured by the rebels and then later escaped. So there's a personal connection. It is an overwhelming experience, a very haunting place.
And that's one of the things you do so well, Kevin, in the book, is that you bring many of these places we've all heard of on one level, but then it's like you illuminate faith into that. You tell the story, obviously, of Gettysburg and the confession that everybody received. I thought beautifully that it was meant for both the North and the South. That was just a beautiful image.
Yes.
But
Corby,
when we think of pilgrimage, honestly, I think most people think of Lourdes, Fatima. Actually, I'll be going to Guadalupe next week. But you really say that there's things here in our backyard that we can actually. So what is the nature of pilgrimage? What makes it a pilgrimage? And there are holy sites all around us?
Yeah. Well, a pilgrimage, I guess in its most basic definition, I would say a pilgrimage is just a movement from one place to another with spiritual intent or a spiritual aim. So that's a broad definition. I think that can apply to different faith traditions, but certainly the idea of pilgrimage extends across faith traditions.
Sure.
In Islam and in Buddhism and so forth, there's also a heritage of pilgrimage. Now, Christians or Catholics may have a slightly different theology and a different practice of it, but I do think there's something common there in the human experience.
Mike Aquilina, who wrote a very nice foreword to your book, quotes your mother, who says, anytime you go out the front door, you're on pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, well, I think it can be. It all depends on your mentality, right? And I think the idea of pilgrimage is deeply rooted in the human experience, and maybe specifically in Catholic or Christian theology in particular. I mentioned, speaking of the introduction, I mentioned Augustine, who also has a deep theology of pilgrimage, and the idea, Augustine connects it to the idea that our very lives are pilgrimages.
Right. Yeah.
This is not our final home. We are in the midst of a movement from one place to another.
Yeah.
I think that's what the practice of geographical pilgrimage can also speak to, can help remind us that we are transients in this world.
When you think about Christianity and its Catholic form and compare it to other religions, especially the monotheistic ones, Islam and Judaism, we don't notice the revolution that occurred, say, 2,000 years ago, because not only Islam, but also Judaism and other religions had this mandatory pilgrimage, to Mecca, to Jerusalem 3 times a year for adult males and this sort of thing. And so when Christianity happened, it's the air we breathe. But if you were to take people from the first century, transport them to the 21st, they'd look around and be shocked that there is no temple where pilgrims come at least once a year, where priests stand on an altar and offer animal sacrifice. There must not be religion anymore, But the fact is, when pilgrimages were, no longer legally mandatory, they actually became much more widespread in Christian tradition. Bethlehem, of course, not just Jerusalem, but as you mentioned, Lourdes and Fatima and so many other places. And I was just finishing up a book a couple of years ago, Catholics in Exile, Biblical Wisdom for the Journey Home, picking up on that theme that you just mentioned, that our life is a pilgrimage. And so, that actually frees you up to decenter so that it's not just Jerusalem or Mecca. It can be Maria Stein in Ohio,
Right.
It's remarkable, and we barely notice it.
When John Paul II was dying in the last days of his ordeal, he spoke of the great pilgrimage to the Father, which had defined his life. And then he's sort of asking permission if he can go home to complete the pilgrimage. And that was really very moving, I think. And when you think of the apostles on their way to Emmaus, they're in a kind of pilgrimage mode. They're looking for meaning, but they're so crestfallen because the guy who grounds all the meaning of the universe was just murdered. And so they feel hopeless, but suddenly there he is. And I would think if the pilgrimage is authentic, there is an abiding presence of Christ. He doesn't leave you alone. He's there with you.
Yeah. There's an ancient Catholic hymn titled O Esca Viatorum, which is food of travelers.
Yeah.
And I think it also reflects this concept, right? And the idea that the Eucharist is, the symbolism of the Eucharist is deep and rich, and there are all kinds of dimensions to it. But one dimension of it is that it's food for the journey. In particular, viaticum, food for the journey, the transition from this life to the next, but also just more generally, our pilgrimage here on earth.
Now, so many of your stories are actually going to places, and all of this is true. And I think the process of pilgrimage brings us back to this. But you are literally going to places. Is there over 24 that you talk about?
Right.
Now, when you were doing it, were they all places that you dreamt of going, or did some of them you just discovered and had never heard of it, or like literally in your backyard sometimes?
Yeah, it's a mixture of the two. Many of the places I have been to, not all of them, in fact about half I've actually been to physically myself. Many of them were just, again, going back to the inspiration for the book, interesting stories that I came across, and I discovered, wow, this is a fascinating spot, in American Catholic history, so I'd like to explore it further and to write about it. But some of them were, deeply personal experiences. You mentioned Maria Stein, which is not far from where I grew up. In fact, my mother was born in Maria Stein, so we have family roots in that area. I'll mention one other kind of personal experience that relates to one of these sites. Maybe we'll talk later about Father Augustus Tolton, the first identifiably Black American Catholic priest. As the book was coming out, so I had my author copy, but it had not yet gone live on Amazon. So I had written about Father Tolton, and the place that I focused on was his burial place, which is in Quincy, Illinois. And it so happened that we were attending a wedding in Denver that spring, and so on the way back, I decided we're going to swing through Quincy, Illinois, and visit the spot that I've already written about. And so we read the chapter as we approached, in the car, as we approached Quincy. We found the tomb, and we visited the gravesite. And his story is just a moving, a poignant one in and of itself. And so reading that and then visiting his burial place was not only personally moving, but as a family, kind of a family experience, of pilgrimage and of getting in touch with this fascinating, holy, moving story of this person.
That's what I appreciate about it. It wasn't like this is a travel agent book, although I think you're actually a beautiful writer. You stress some of the images that you're going to see, which helps them become alive. But again, you bring us there in a faith. It's not just something to see. But there's a reason to see it. With all that, do you have a favorite place?
I have a hard time answering that question.
Well, I'm sure you've been asked it.
That's analogous to asking me, do I have a favorite child?
Yeah, that's right.
Whoever's in your lap.
Exactly. My usual answer is Maria Stein, just because that's the place I've been to most, and it's the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart, because it's been a place, not only a place of family meaning, but also a place that almost a refuge. I've gone there, on retreat when I need to. Well, for example, just a few years ago, actually, I was going through kind of a transition professionally, a difficult personal period. And my family was actually holding a Super Bowl party that day. It was Super Bowl Sunday. And I thought, I'm just not in the mood for the Super Bowl this year, right? Usually I enjoy those, but this year, I'm going to go to Maria Stein for a few hours. I'm going to hang out in the shrine. It was largely empty, but they have a beautiful grounds there, and they have the relic shrine itself, and then a larger church next to it with the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. And I spent a few hours just thinking about my life and where it was going, and trying to listen to God's word about where I should go. And I came out of that with a deep sense of peace. about what was next, and it turned out that what was next was good, and was clearly part of God's plan.
That's one of my favorites too. I'm surprised to hear you say it. I've been there maybe 4 times, and I've spent overnights and that sort of thing. But the German Catholic roots go so deep in that part of Ohio, and there was actually a pilgrimage travelogue where you could see up to at least 10 German Catholic parishes that just sort of dot the landscape.
Yeah, and it's the land of the cross-tipped churches. It's an Ohio Scenic Byway.
Yeah.
It's stunning.
Yeah.
And as you approach them, you're like, it's another church. It's another church.
Beautiful.
And you just feel the faith of those farmers who came and fortunately bought that land when it was still at a pretty low price.
It's almost frozen in time, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not subject to the same changes and grotesqueries of the technological age.
Yeah.
Preserved in amber, sort of like a petrified forest.
But the Precious Blood Fathers, as well as the Precious Blood Devotion, you know, there was a theologian there in the 50s and 60s. His name escapes me. But he was a German Catholic, and he was an amazing theologian on covenant and precious blood. And so that was why I went the first time and went back a second and third time.
Coincidence? I don't think so. No. Stay with us. We have much more to discuss.
An excerpt on pilgrimage. The movement of pilgrim travel reminds us that this world is not our final home. Just as the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, writes John Paul Meenan, we might say that the first step on the road to sanctity is the realization that we are in exile, strangers and sojourners, knowing somehow, some way, we belong somewhere else. Life is a journey toward our ultimate destination, which lies beyond the passageway of death. A Catholic pilgrimage through American history. People and places that shaped the church in the United States, by Dr. Kevin Schmiesing.
Have you ever felt a growing sense of hope in a new day? Like when the dawn light breaks and the world wakes up. We feel that every day because we know that light changes everything. It opens our eyes to possibilities and it propels us forward. Light shows us where we belong. Light is what the world desperately needs. Be light at Franciscan University.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. We've been discussing and learning about the practice of pilgrimage. But one of the interesting things that we find in your book, Kevin, is you're a historian. And you see that we have a history in the United States of difficulty for being Catholic. I mean, a prejudice against Catholic. Now, this probably didn't surprise you. I mean, I knew that it was part of our history, but I mean, so many of the stories you tell, that's at the root of that. Your thoughts about that as a historian and how we've made it through that and how it impacted our country?
Yeah, it's an observation many readers have commented on, that they're surprised at the virulence of anti-Catholicism. Like you say, I wasn't too surprised because I have studied this stuff for a while, so I knew it was there. But this is also a little bit of a side note before I get to the answer to your question. This is also one of the motivations for writing the book, is that there's a rich academic American Catholic literature that most Catholics don't know anything about. Yeah. And so in part, I wanted to bring pieces of that, at least, themes from that, to a broader audience. So that was one of the things I was striving to do. And anti-Catholicism is one of those. There's been lots written on anti-Catholicism in the scholarly literature over the last 10 years or so. So we really know a lot about it, but again, a lot of Catholics don't. So why? Well, I think contemporary Catholics can have some insight into the answer to that question if they just think about why in the current American culture are Catholics hated in some circles, or Catholics are discriminated against in some circles. Maybe some of the issues are slightly different, but I think, you know, behind them, there's still a lot of the same sort of motivation, a lot of the same kind of animus that's at the root of it. So, for one thing, Catholics are different. I mean, this country was founded, for better and for worse, basically as a Protestant nation. At least the vast majority of Americans at the time of the founding were Protestants of one variety or another. deists, maybe liberal Protestants, more conservative evangelical Protestants. And to some degree, it was founded as a haven from the problems of the old world. And one of the problems of the old world was Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, they came here to escape people like us.
They came here to escape people like us.
But also established churches like the Church of England.
And then to oppress people like us. Right. Arthur Schlesinger Sr., I think, described the anti-Semitism of the intellectuals as anti-Catholicism.
Yes, one of the deepest
really
biases
chic.
in American history.
It's acceptable,
Yeah, exactly. So it is deeply rooted in American history. And I think once you understand that history, you know, the first colonies here were early 17th century. The religious wars are still going on in Europe. Protestants and Catholics are killing each other. This is a very much a live issue for American colonials. And I think once you understand that historical background, you can gain an appreciation for why there was a genuine fear of Catholicism. That doesn't excuse it. That doesn't mean it was soundly based. But I think it does help us understand it.
But even in that, you provide context. You tell the story of the stone that was given for the Washington Monument that was thrown in the Potomac. You tell about, you know, were Catholics behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Both really, really wonderful stories. But again, to be able to highlight one of the struggles that Catholics were having.
Yeah, that's what I try to do is grab people's interest with a fascinating story and then connect it to the more general themes, kind of the more, I guess, important or substantial themes in American history. And so, you know, looking further at this anti-Catholic strain, it's also the case that anti-Catholicism is closely bound to nativism, another strong strain in American history. And so by nativism, I mean the favor toward those who are already here.
Right.
All Americans are immigrants somewhere back in history. But for those who have been here a little longer than the immigrants who are arriving now. And so heavy American Catholic Irish immigration in the 1840s, German Catholic immigration, later on Italians, Poles, and others, and all of that kind of gives Catholicism in the American context a foreign flavor.
And then you consider things like the Ku Klux Klan, the revival of it in a still more virulent form. It was certainly directed against black people after the Civil War, but they zeroed in on Catholics as well. They had plenty of hate for both groups. And I think we felt the lash of that animus.
Yeah, to be sure. It's something that surprisingly a lot of Americans aren't familiar with. Everyone knows that the KKK was anti-black, which is true. They were also very anti-Catholic and more generally nativist. And in fact, if you look at some contemporary writings, say the revival of the Klan in the 1920s, for example, you'll see lines even from someone like Booker T. Washington, a prominent African American, talks about Italians being treated as badly or worse than African Americans. So there was, you know, not that we're in a kind of contest to see who was treated worse in American history, but the point is that, you know, this is something real. It's not just kind of Catholic specialty.
Well, you think of the resistance that Mother Cabrini faced when she arrived in New York, the embedded hatred of the Italians. And, you know, the Irish are now lording it over the Italians, and before that, the Anglo-Saxons were tyrannizing over the Irish. But it was difficult. It made her apostolate all the more challenging, and her achievement all the more heroic.
Yes, that's right.
You know, it's almost a subplot in the book because, you know, you have 27 stories, you know, that are all in themselves fascinating. But the geographical distribution is what surprised me. I mean, from St. Augustine, Florida, up to Alaska, where the Archbishop is shot in his sleep, you know. But it's also the historical breadth. And so the subcurrent is, man, we've been targeted and hated, you know, practically everywhere throughout the history of our people, you know. But on the other hand, I have to admit, being anti-Catholic as an evangelical Calvinist for nearly 10 years, I don't justify it. You can't. But I do understand it because it's not like, you know, the Lutherans or the Methodists or the Presbyterians or the Baptists. There really is something strange about the sacred mysteries. And, you know, we get so familiar, as we should, as Catholics living in America or anywhere else in the world, But the real presence, and the Blessed Virgin and the saints and all of the things that we do, it gives us this internationalism, this true Catholicity that is never at home where people simply want to do nothing more than make America great again. Let's make the world closer to Christ. But I must admit, I wish that you could teach a course and have this as the text, because you could basically train up people to really enter into a lay apostolate as American Catholics who have a deeper understanding.
It's sort of like the hatred directed against the Jews by the Nazis, not for anything they did, but simply because who they were. I mean, we are a provocation to the non-Catholic world, because the claims we make are pretty exclusivist, pretty imperious. The supremacy of the papal office. I mean, that's why they're driven to think we're stockpiling weapons at the Vatican to take over the world, and priests have horns, so we have to somehow disarm them. I mean, I understand that kind of paranoia, but it's still with us.
Right.
I mean, that's why a place like Maryland is so astonishing.
Yes.
I mean, this represented a sanctuary, genuine religious toleration for a time. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary.
That's right. Yes.
Mary's land.
And speak to that is that while there was prejudice, there also were founding fathers. There were places of conclave that they could get away to. So speak to.
So this is the other point I always want to make when I talk about anti-Catholicism, and I teach a church history course, and it's not American church history exclusively. I go through the entire scope of church history, but I end in the Americas, and I talk about anti-Catholicism in the American church. But I also stress that that's not the whole story of the church in the United States.
Right.
It's also a land of promise, even for Catholics who may be discriminated against and persecuted in some cases. And Maryland's a great example of that. So insofar as there were Catholics in the colonies, they were basically in two places, in Pennsylvania and Maryland. And there are religious reasons for both of those. Pennsylvania was a Quaker colony, and Quakers genuinely, sincerely tried to be religiously tolerant, sometimes succeeded. And so Philadelphia became one of the centers of Catholic population because Catholics were more or less welcome there, at least compared to places like Massachusetts or Virginia. The other really interesting case is Maryland. Maryland actually founded not as a specifically Catholic colony, actually as a place of religious toleration. There were about an even number of Catholics and Protestants who came on the first ships to Maryland in
the Ark and the Dove.
1634.
Our Mayflower.
Yeah, exactly. I call it the Catholic Plymouth Rock. I call it St. Mary's City in Maryland.
Right.
So unfortunately, this experiment in religious liberty didn't last very long because Protestants kind of took over the colony, and then it became just another Protestant British colony. But the foundation for religious liberty, I think, was laid, and the experience of the Maryland colony was drawn on later when the founders were thinking about how we can create a new nation that will be a welcoming place for people of all faiths and of none, as the case may be.
You know, I'm really struck by something that Alan Keyes had said some years ago. He ran for president. It was an abortive campaign. But his family came from Maryland. They were black, and they were evangelized early on in Maryland. And they kept the faith. They were steadfast. And that was a point of pride that he insisted upon, that it was really necessary that this ethos be maintained even in the teeth of Puritan oppression. There's the Whig interpretation of history that I'm sure you're familiar with. The side that wins, they write the history.
Right.
The losers, they write the stories. I mean, that's what Walker Percy said when they asked him, why are there so many fine Southern writers? And his answer was, because we lost the war.
Yeah.
It produces better copy, more interesting stories.
Yeah.
But if it weren't for the Whig interpretation, we might give Maryland a different perspective. And we don't, and that's really a pity.
Yeah, but you're right that the legacy of Maryland lived on in folks like Alan Keyes. Also, think about another chapter in this book. I talk about Bardstown, Kentucky, which is surprisingly one of the earliest dioceses in the United States, because we have this settlement of Catholics, old Maryland Catholic families moving west on the Cumberland Trail and settling the frontier. As you know, all students of American history are familiar with that story and its general outlines. but few of them know that there was a Catholic dimension of this, as these Maryland Catholics
Yeah,
moving
the
into
whole
West.
element of grace and geography somehow mixed together. Let's not forget whiskey. I mean, 95% of the world's bourbon is produced in Kentucky.
Thank you for that clarifying point. I'm surprised you didn't say more about that. Well, but one can't argue, or it's undeniable, when you take a look at the country, and you speak of this of the missions, when Juniper Serra, I mean, you go up the coast of California, and it's saint. So that while there was difficulty, there was struggle, but the impact that the Catholic Church has had on our country is undeniable. You see that across the board. And you take us to Kentucky. Most people probably don't think about Kentucky when they think of a Catholic influence.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
And it is, once you start looking for it, you find it all over. And yes, in some states more than others, but as you pointed out earlier, Scott, I made a deliberate effort to make this geographically and chronologically comprehensive, so that it would speak to a lot of people, for one thing, but also so that it would demonstrate the ubiquity of the Catholic presence in our country, even in unexpected places.
And just huge adversity that would militate against any successful enterprise. I think of Juniper Serra, who suffered this leg injury that really sort of hobbled him, and yet he was able to walk pretty much the entire length of the California coast. Every 20 miles, he plants another mission church.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty amazing. And then the story of Mother Cabrina, I'm always edified by her example. She was pathologically afraid of water because she nearly drowned as a child. And she made the transatlantic crossing, God knows how many times.
22 times, I think. It's in the book.
Yeah, just amazing. Yeah, that to overcome adversity in that way.
Yeah.
Hold it. Stay with us. We'll be back with more Franciscan University Presents.
An excerpt on Maryland. St. Mary's City is the Jamestown or Plymouth Rock for American Catholics, the place where Catholic forebears landed in the New World and planted a colony in the face of manifold challenges. The Ark was our Mayflower, the ship that brought a group of brave adventurers seeking freedom and opportunity. A Catholic pilgrimage through American history. People and Places That Shaped the Church in the United States by Dr. Kevin Schmiesing.
Walk in the footsteps of saints and martyrs on a Franciscan University pilgrimage. You'll explore the treasures of your Catholic heritage in the Holy Land, Poland, France, Austria, Italy, and more destinations. Find out more at franciscan.edu/pilgrimages.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us. You're watching Franciscan University Presents, which we record here in the ComArts studio at Franciscan University in Steubenville. Our students are operating the cameras and the equipment, and our theology professors, Dr. Martin and Dr. Hahn, and I are speaking with Franciscan University alumni, I'll stress that again, Dr. Kevin Schmiesing, who is the author of A Catholic Pilgrimage Through American History. At the last section, we were talking a little bit about Cabrini, maybe just a thought about Cabrini and the impact that she's had, but also what she teaches us.
Yeah, Regis was mentioning the difficulties that St. Francis Cabrini faced and how that's a common theme across the American Catholic experience. And so it led me to think about, just the concept of perseverance in the face of adversity. This is something that you see kind of like Anti-Catholicism is one of those themes that keeps coming up in each of the chapters. Mm-hmm. This perseverance is also one of the themes. And I think it helps us when we familiarize ourselves with those stories. It helps us gain an appreciation for those who went before us. This is, for me, one of the main purposes of studying history, is to gain this sense of appreciation, and I think it instills in us also a sense of gratitude toward those who came before us, which I think is a healthy kind of Christian attitude to have toward the past, rather than one of primarily of critique or of disapprobation or of condemnation. Instead, one of gratitude, because we stand on the shoulders of giants in many ways, and that's true in American Catholic history as it is more generally in the Catholic tradition.
Sure. In many of those states, individuals you talked about, Francis Cabrini, was there an individual you mentioned, Father Tolton? Was he the one that kind of captured your imagination most, or was there another saint that's American saint?
Yeah, no, for sure, Father Augustus Tolton, who is on the path towards sainthood, maybe someday.
Right. Yeah.
And his story I found especially poignant because of because of the attitude he maintained in the face of consistent, almost unrelenting difficulties. And not only difficulties from outside the church. So we've talked about anti-Catholicism. American Catholics shared that challenge in common. But Father Tolton faced challenges within the church itself. He couldn't enter a seminary in the United States because there wasn't one that would accept a black candidate in the late 19th century. And so he ended up studying at the Seminary of the Propaganda Fide, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, in Rome, which was very welcoming to people of all racial backgrounds, naturally. And then came back to the United States and continued to face discrimination, again, not only from non-Catholics, which is kind of the general racism in American society at the time, but also from Catholics and even from Catholic priests and bishops. And it would be easy in that situation to fall into bitterness and disillusionment, and many have, and I think that's an understandable temptation. But Father Tolton never did. He continued to cleave to the Catholic Church as being the one true church, but also the true home for all people of all backgrounds, including him, including people of African descent. He saw that more clearly. He saw the true theology of the church more clearly.
That's the most
many
astounding
Catholics
thing
around
about him, the fact that he refused to be embittered by this real conspiracy of hatred and enmity directed at him. Somebody said that the value of any virtue is shown at the testing point when you have to summon the courage to exercise it. And I think we see that dramatically in his life. I also think of Flannery O'Connor, who required a great deal of courage to face her own struggles. I mean, she succumbed finally to lupus, the disease that had killed her father, but she was thriving in New York at the time, and then she's struck down. She has to return to Milledgeville in Georgia, and for the next 14 years, she does her dying every day. I mean, that's just a constant quotidian exercise of courage that you can't help but admire, and that may be one of the reasons that her cause may shortly be introduced. Who knows?
Yeah, she's another fascinating character facing adversities of a different kind, as you say, physical adversities, but also a Catholic in the South, right? So being a black Catholic would be one kind of minority within a dominant culture, and then being a Catholic in the South, a different kind of minority and a different kind of dominant culture. But also, again, the problems within the church itself, or the challenges she faced within the church itself. Not profound an understanding of what she was trying to do in a literary way, which also had a strong moral and theological dimension, but many Catholics at the time did not appreciate Flannery O'Connor's approach to
you quote part of something she said, which has always struck me as prophetic. She said, in the South, they're not Christ-centered, but they are Christ-haunted. They're very much afraid that man may have been made in the image and likeness of God after all. And so the freak becomes a figure for our own essential displacement from God. And that's what she wrote about. She captured the freak. And somebody asked her, well, why do you keep writing about them? All these misfits, these crazy people. Why can't you write about ordinary people like us? And she said, I write about freaks because I believe in them. I recognize one. This is how God sees us. We're kind of freakish.
Yeah, her story was something, that quote I thought was really moving as well. But the other is that she was also a white woman in the context being in the South. And we have a danger sometimes to take a look at her, try to put her in today's word, some of her writings, some people might be struggling with. But you stress that is she was a white woman consistent with a Catholic in her time. Which is, again, this sense of persistence and continuing to struggle with adversity was wonderful. A couple of things I just thought were fascinating. Abraham Lincoln, his assassination, the Catholics were not behind that, right?
Well, that depends what you mean by that.
That's right.
So
that was a fascinating story.
Were there Catholics involved in the Lincoln assassination? The answer is yes, there were Catholics involved. Most notably John Surratt, who was, as far as we can tell, a practicing Catholic, not quite sure exactly his level of devotion to the faith, but certainly to some extent or to some degree a Catholic. He, ironically, the one of the conspirators who was never convicted and punished for being a part of the conspiracy because he fled the country. So he was not, there were 8 people who were convicted, including his mother, Mary, who was executed by the federal government, hanged. But John fled the country and then came back, and the moment had passed, the moment of vengeance had passed, and so people weren't calling for blood anymore, and so he escaped punishment. But I think probably more precisely what you're referring to is, was it a kind of Catholic conspiracy in a broader sense? Was it, the Pope in Rome, the head of the Papal States behind this somehow trying to undermine the American government? And I think the pretty clear answer to that is no. It was, there were plenty of people at the time who did not like Abraham Lincoln, to understate the matter. And so it was much more an anti-Lincoln sort of Confederate-driven sort of plot rather than having anything to do with the Catholic faith.
You know, there is another takeaway from the book. Besides the obvious lessons of perseverance in the face of adversity, and that is, I'm not sure exactly how to express this, but the breadth of Catholics over the centuries. You know, I think I'm reminded of James Joyce, I think it was, who said that when he entered the church, you know, he discovered, here comes everybody. And the spectrum, the pluralistic spectrum of American Catholics. I mean, today it haunts us because it's, you know, pro-abort politicians and all of that sort of thing. But, you know, variations of that appear down through the centuries in America as well. You've got devout Catholic priests for the South, the Confederacy, as well as the North. You know, and you have Americanists like Isaac Hecker and the Paulists and others too. And those who would be staunchly Catholic in the face of American, you know, manifest destiny. And it's really an important lesson, I think, for us to recognize that when you scout the pews in any ordinary parish, you see a similar sort of diversity. And it just doesn't fit my experience as an evangelical pastor. You know, you basically could, it's like in the neighborhood, you could pick your teammates, you know, as you went back. And so the Catholic Church is just this thing where here comes everybody. And not just throughout America, down through the ages, but also in various dioceses.
Well, one striking example that you cite would be the Russian prince.
Yes,
Dimitris
Gallitzin.
Yeah, I mean, Loretto, Pennsylvania. What the hell is he doing here in the middle of Pennsylvania? His godmother had been the Empress Catherine of Russia, and he ends up in this.
That happens to be my mother. So godforsaken.
You must tell us about Loretto. I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary setting.
No,
he made a huge splash
it's a great
in
story.
that area.
I love the fact that you added that.
Demetrius Gallitzin, one of the earliest priests ordained in the United States, actually, not the first, but he may have been the second or the third, ordained by Bishop Carroll in Baltimore. And he's a convert to Catholicism. From Russian Orthodox.
I mean, that's startling.
He's an unusual figure, to say the least. So I think if I remember the story correctly, he actually has interaction with some priests on board the ship while he's traveling to the United States from Russia, and that's what kind of prompts either his conversion or at least his decision to become a priest. And so, yes, this Russian prince who could have enjoyed a life of ease and luxury ends up on what was at the time the frontier in America, the wilderness of central and western Pennsylvania, and helps to lay the foundation for what would become a very Catholic part of Pennsylvania and of the United States, and Loretto is part of that community.
But there you see this connection with Charles Schwab, who will come by later as a steel baron, and he's the one who helps fund much of what was built there. Well, what I was struck by, obviously I've been to Loretto. I mean, I've lived there. So you would just drive by, you would never drive by Loretto. You would take a side road and you would never go through Loretto, Pennsylvania. But one of the things that the books did is, for me, is you're driving through this little town that nobody would even stop, and yet there's Prince Gallitzin who's buried there, and it's beautiful. You've been there. You walk down into the tomb and you see where he's buried. You would just drive by it if you didn't know it. And what you do in this book is there are the things like that all across the country if we just have isolated.
He's buried outside the Basilica of St. Michael, which is a
beautiful
magnificent church.
Yes.
It was funded with Schwab money,
Yes.
but it otherwise seems like the middle of nowhere.
Yeah,
But there's a Prince Gallitzin Park as well. In his writings, his cause is now underway. I remember decades ago, when the show was still young, Matthew Bunson had published a biography of Prince Gallitzin for the diocese out there. I don't know if it's Greensburg, Altoona, or what.
Altoona,
Johnstown, yeah. And I began to read his writings on scripture apologetics and this sort of thing. What a master.
But if you trace all of the threads, you end up in the Holy Land. Loretto, the house of Loretto, sort of miraculously transported to a suburb of Rome, and then it receives the same name when they develop this town in the center of Pennsylvania. I mean, the connections
and the friars
are
come there in
rich.
1847. So
Prince Gallitzin died in 1840, so I mean, the legacy is pretty fresh.
Yeah, there are all sorts of interesting nomenclature connections like that. There's a Loretto in Kentucky, actually, near Bardstown.
That's right.
What we were talking about. And of course, all the mission sites in California, which you also mentioned.
Was there, this may seem odd, but was there one that isn't in the book that you said, oh, if I was to write a sequel, I would want to talk about this one?
There's actually a long list of those.
Oh, really?
Maybe there will be a sequel
that's great.
someday
That's
if I have time to do it. I'm not too optimistic about it, but possibly. But at least one that springs to mind. There's a monastery in Connecticut, which is where there was a film made about it in the 1930s, I want to say, about the story of the founding of this monastery at Regina Laudis, the Abbey of Regina Laudis. And there's a number of fascinating stories connected with that, among which is the story of Dolores Hart, who was a Hollywood actress who ended up entering the Abbey and has been a nun for some 40 or 50 years at this point. She was the first on-screen kiss of Elvis Presley. That's what she was known for as an actress, but ended up at the Abbey of Regina Laudis.
Somehow.
Yes, exactly.
And what about the North American martyrs? I think they belong in the
American
sequel
martyrs,
as well.
for
That's
sure.
hallowed ground.
Yeah. Franciscan University of Steubenville.
Yeah, right.
We could talk about a lot of interesting people who have passed through the doors of this place over the decades.
Definitely. Definitely the
Well, like yourself.
Good company included. No, I was just struck just with that is that no matter where you go, you're finding places and stories. And what you really are able to do is to bring them alive. We talked at the very beginning about the story. And that's what you do magnificently, is you bring the storyline. It makes it interesting. I like at the beginning, you always say, did you know? And it's kind of this heading for each of the particular stories. In most of, I would say half of them, yes, I knew, half of them I didn't know. So I'm appreciative of that. Up next, our panel and our guest will share our final thoughts on Catholics and Catholic pilgrimage places in American history. Please stay with us.
An excerpt on Father Augustus Tolton. Whenever his schedule permitted, Father Augustus Tolton acceded to requests from around the country to speak to Catholic audiences eager to learn about the first black priest and the importance of ministry to Catholics of color. Some of the content of his speeches was preserved and reconstructed in a mission journal in 1945. It provides insight into how Tolton could remain so loyal to a church in which he was so often degraded. A Catholic Pilgrimage Through American History, People and Places That Shaped the Church in the United States by Dr. Kevin Schmiesing.
When you see the world through a Catholic lens, you see God's hand at work in human history. You see the true, the good, the beautiful. Franciscan University of Steubenville's Master of Arts in Catholic Studies is an online program that offers courses in literature, biology, art, theology, psychology, all taught from a distinctively Catholic perspective, so you can see the world with Catholic eyes. Find out more about the Masters in Catholic Studies. Go to franciscan.edu/MCS.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. We've come to our final segment. Regis, your concluding thoughts.
Yeah, Kevin, what a wonderful book you've put together, and really a fascinating conversation we've had around it. A memory was sparked in the closing moments of the last segment, Franciscan University, and it reminded me of a certain profile in courage. Bishop Muzio, who had been the first bishop of Steubenville, I think when it was established back in the mid-1940s, the first idea he had in his head was to found a college. And just an amazing thing here in a steel town. You want to build a house of education. But it was after the war, a lot of guys with the GI Bill could finance their studies, and nobody else had done this. So he approaches the Jesuits to ask them, would you like to come and staff my new college? They're completely indifferent because there's no money. And so the TORs, they leap at the opportunity.
Coming from Loretto.
From Loretto, of all places. They come here and they establish a school, and the rest is history. I mean, it's been here for more than, 70 years. That's pretty astonishing. And what has happened, I mean, the outcome of that one initiative taken by one obscure bishop and a brave set of friars sort of changed the world. I mean, none of us would be here but for that. So that belongs in your book.
That's good. Thanks. Good. We look forward to that.
I back that too. I mean, for 20 years nearly, we have been living in what all of the natives of Steubenville call the bishop's house. And so Bishop Musio
That's right.
there, yeah. You know, when Kimberly first came into the church back in '90, the first time she gave her own story, her testimony, as we would say, was in Bardstown. And so we had 2.5 days there, if memory serves. And it was sort of like our baptism into American Catholic church history. I mean, I knew salvation history. I was a student of church history, but not American church. Bardstown, Kentucky, we just assumed that it was going to be a little parish in a fundamentalist enclave. It was anything but. And then when we moved to Steubenville, we also discovered that Archbishop John Neumann, was here. And, our parish, St. Peter's, the Eucharistic Chapel, you have relics of his, but you also have this sense that he signed the baptismal registry because he baptized members of our parish. And then I also have a dear friend, we have a mutual friend, Mike Aquilina, who does pilgrimages for people into Catholic Pittsburgh. And I grew up in Pittsburgh. I grew up Protestant, but I had no idea. And so like leaven in the bread, there really is a sense in which we're persevering in the face of adversity. But that old saying, they buried us, but they didn't know we were seeds. It strikes me that we are seeds and that our apostolate, our mission, it's anything but complete, and that American Catholics don't have to plot out any sort of political program. We don't have to wait until we have achieved consensus, in socioeconomic matters. I mean, you were at the Acton Institute, you know what I'm talking about. There's a broad spectrum, as there always will be, and as there probably should be. But I think just entering into our own area and enculturating the gospel in Steubenville, Ohio, in Pittsburgh, in Loretto, to me, that is the wonderful adventure of being Catholic, basically blooming where you're planted. And that book of yours really helped enkindle in me that sense. And I want to share this with family members and friends.
Great.
Thanks for writing it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Final thoughts.
Yeah, I want to thank you all for your comments, very astute, and I appreciate this conversation very much. A theme that has come up in a lot of these comments is the idea of story. And Scott, you mentioned salvation history. Well, this is what Christianity is all about, right? Christianity is a story.
Right.
First and foremost, the story of the Incarnation, the story of Christ, and then it's all of these individual stories that come along later, in our case, much later. But life is really a story, and salvation history is one big story that contains a lot of smaller stories,
right, yeah.
of which each of us is one part. And that's the way I organize this book, as we've talked about, around places. But places are really simply spots where people come together. A place is a kind of nexus where all these personal stories intersect. And both of you have made many connections, all three of you have made many connections of various people who have passed through these various places. And so, in closing, I just want to encourage people to discover the stories that are connected to their places. You don't have to travel far away to find these stories. Start with your own parish church. I bet you there are some interesting stories connected to your own parish if you start to dig into it. And this just, besides everything else, it enriches your life as a Catholic to understand and to appreciate all those who have gone before and help to build what you are now enjoying as an American Catholic in the 21st century.
Good. Thank you so much. If you would like to learn more about today's topic, we have a free handout, the introduction to Dr. Schmiesing's book, A Catholic Pilgrimage Through American History. This introduction is yours for free by going online to faithandreason.com/presents or by calling the number we will provide momentarily. I was struck by, and you alluded to it, a quote by John Paul II, which is, all of the Christian life is a pilgrimage leading us to the heart of the Father. I had the opportunity a number of years ago to do the pilgrimage of walking the Camino. And whenever I sign a book, I always write just one step at a time. Because this journey, this pilgrimage of faith is that. I think at times we so focus on the destination that we fail to recognize that just all around us all the time, the Lord is present. And that's one of the things I think this book, I so appreciated, is my suspicion is, and you just stated that, is just about every town, every church has a story. You know, whatever city you're in, whatever state you're in, there are so many things that I was thinking, oh, I wonder if he wrote about this or he's going to write about that. And part of that is the beauty that pilgrimage has. One of the things that pilgrimage allows us to do is to get out of our ordinary routine. And I think pilgrimage is really ultimately a mindset. As I stated, I'll be going to Guadalupe soon. And to be able to be away from the university, be away from my room, be away from things that are familiar, that allows me to discover the Lord's presence there. And ultimately, I think that was what I take away from the book is wonderful stories, wonderful places, but ultimately it's an encounter. It's an encounter, and you use the story as the place of the encounter, but it's an encounter to faith. It's an encounter to the individual who animated that, like you talked about, perseverance and difficulty and struggle and all of that. But ultimately, it ought to lead us to the person of Jesus. And that enables us to, all the world that we're going through, it's not just coincidence, but the Lord is actually moving in this. And then what you do, I thought so beautifully, is put this in the American experience. So many of our pilgrimages are going to Lourdes or to Fatima or Guadalupe. We have to go somewhere out there, and this challenges us. No, is that we have a really rich American history of faith, of difficulty, of struggle, and perseverance that ultimately we ought to be able to celebrate. And that's really what it did. It made me more proud to be a Catholic in the midst of this place that we call home. I was greatly appreciated it. And finally, is I just think in my own life and growing up, we did little trips and we would often, sometimes it would be just going to there was two small Catholic churches, and there was the closed church and there was the further away. And there was this sense of movement, and it was a different church and it was not familiar, but there was something about my family going to that church or going to the cathedral that just, again, as a little kid, kind of stirred in our heart. And I think that's the invitation you have, is to go out of your hometown, look and find and discover the Lord there, and you discover stories there. Amen?
Amen.
Thank you so much. Well, we ask the Lord's blessing upon us in our pilgrimage of faith, that we would, no matter where we are, discover the Lord, discover His presence, discover the beauty of the church. May Almighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Download a free handout on today's topic at faithandreason.com/presents. You can also watch past episodes of Franciscan University Presents or request the handout by emailing us at presents@franciscan.edu. Or reach us by phone for today's handout by calling 800-783-6447. That's 800-783-6447.